to start it. Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Ana Villalon. I'm based on the Dublin office in MRG, and I will be your host today along with my colleague Tori Rachel, who is here for extra support. Your presenters today will be David Griffith and Andrew Durand. Just a few items for housekeeping, just to minimize distractions. We will all mute and turn off our cameras when the lecture starts. Questions can be entered on the chat box that you will see on the bottom of your screen, depending on your settings. At the end of the lecture, at some point in between, we will just get to address some of them, or if not all. This session is being recorded and you will receive a follow-up email with the link to the recording and also the slides deck. Around 40 minutes in the session, we will go into interactive session in breakout rooms. So if anyone needs to leave before that, please do let me know, so I will exclude you from them. I think that's it. Without further delay, I'm gonna pass it to your first presenter today, who is David.
Thank you, Anna. It's always a pleasure to work with Anna and Tori, and while Drew and I are the voices and the talking heads today, largely, don't forget that we represent a community in MRG of people who put a great deal of work into the assessments and the customer service. So it's a great privilege to kind of be here and speaking on their behalf as well. Greetings from a sunny day in Ireland. I don't know what to do with it. It's been such a long time since we saw the sun. I think we've forgotten what, Anna and I forgotten what the damn thing looks like. So long may it last, eh? So today we're going to be focusing on using the IDI and LEA for selection. We want to focus on some of the practical things, but I think it's good to have a sense of the trajectory about how we're going to use our time. Just remember, this is being recorded. You will get a copy of the recording, including the slides. So don't be concerned about trying to memorize all of this. We're always available to help you if you have any questions subsequently, or if you're doing some work in this or other areas and you'd like some support on it. It's part of what we do. So just feel free to access us at any time you like. Anna summarized it very effectively. The first piece is really just going to be talking a little bit about the instruments, about what's going on in assessment for selection, where the instrument fit in that context before we start doing some practical work. And then we'll do a quick wrap up at the end. Any questions that you have, any follow-up that you think would be relevant, any ideas you may have about other webinars or workshops that we do, because we love doing them. So what's going on in assessment? A lot is the truthful answer. I think what's interesting is, as we all know, last year was pretty much down in terms of most aspects of HR practice, be it in selection or development or coaching or otherwise, but because of the world that we lived in. But we're certainly seeing things rebound now, and I think organizations have normalized a lot of their practices and technology enablement to the extent that it interferes less with all the things that they want to do. And I think arguably there's a pent-up demand in this regard. However, selection practices, like a lot of HR processes, tend to lag behind. I'm generalizing here, but there is still a great degree of conventional thinking in the world of assessment, in the world of human resources. They want to go for the safer bets. It takes process a long time to evolve for them to try new things. In some cases, they would prefer to stick to the devil they know, in many cases, literally. So let's look at the different types of tools and what's going on, and then we'll look at what tends to work most effectively based on empirical research. So there are many different types and categories, but broadly the first one are the kind of the more evaluative, skill-based types of instruments. So the cognitive, the verbal reasoning, diagrammatic reasoning. If managing complexity and paradox, or if certain specific skill types, verbal reasoning, for example, numerical reasoning, are important, these can be easy to use. They're quite accessible. You don't need elevated qualifications to get them. A big piece of what I use is in the cognitive space. So the Watson-Glaser, the Raven progressive matrices. AH4 is a really interesting one, developed for pilots during World War II. Trust me. The predictive index, the CPP, and so on. We then get to the category of instruments that measure more intrinsic characteristics, more trait than state, as they say. So the 16PF, the 15FP, the OPQ, the NEO-PIR, Hogan. I think with the exception of 15FP, I'm certified with every single one of these. That gets more to the DNA of the individual. In many cases, it helps to identify aspects of the individual which are not necessarily observable, because we can only observe a person's behavior. And it can be very, very helpful for a couple of reasons. Obviously, if you're going to place your bet, we're going to hire someone, or we're going to promote someone, or we want to do a high potential program, and we want to measure characteristics that tend to be a little bit more intrinsic to the individual as opposed to reflecting their context, and which are probably to a greater degree more stable over time. These categories can be very, very helpful. There are relative upsides and downsides on choosing NEO versus Hogan versus IDI versus OPQ, etc., etc. If ever you want to do a deeper dive, or if you're doing an RFP and the client is using Hogan and you want to try and steer them away from all of that, we have a fair bit of work done on the relative advantages of IDI or LEA or otherwise over, or how they are different from, and in what specific ways. So always feel free to access us, because we can probably save you a heck of a lot of time and give you more immediate answers. You'll notice that the Myers-Briggs type indicator is not there, simply because it is not valid for selection. Then you get the behaviors, all sorts of different ones. These are just a few examples. The LEA obviously is the MRG version of all of that, measuring 22 behaviors. And it can be important. The benefit of measuring behaviors in this context is that a lot of job descriptions or role requirements are articulated in behavioral terms. We want someone who is a strategic thinker. We want someone who drives innovation. We want someone who pays attention to the detail. We want someone who just asserts a level of command, etc., etc. That can be very, very helpful. The limiting factor about behaviors, if you measure them just by themselves, is how much of that behavior you're measuring reflects the person versus how much reflects the environment in which they find themselves. And the answer is you will never know. Toss a coin. In fact, statistically, tossing a coin has a higher predictive value because you get a 0.5 coefficient. Are the behaviors that we're measuring in that person, what you're measuring is a person's behavior in that other context before we hire them, assuming it's an external. Are those behaviors necessarily going to come with the person? We don't know that. It's harder to get that sense when you just measure the behavior. That is why using the IDI and the LEA, or using the behavioral measure a lot as well as an intrinsic measure, whatever it may be, can be a very helpful thing to combine. I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and Drew is certainly going to expand on that later, so I'm not going to preface that too much. This, I emphasize, is the assessment methods that are demonstrated to have reasonably strong predictive value. Now, this is up to management level. A lot of organizations are still using assessment centers. They're having to virtualize it, which is an interesting thing. And that is often a combination of the psychometric measurement as well as the observational measurement, doing simulations, in-tray exercises, all of the usual stuff that goes into assessment centers. I've done a fair bit of it in my time. If anyone wants to pick my brain at some point, do let me know. The structured interviews, typically contingent on knowing what you're looking for and developing intelligent questions that get to all of that. My energy saps a little bit when I hear the cliches. Where do you see yourself in 5 years? What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? You know, I mean, seriously, it's extraordinary how much of that is still out there. One intelligent question will say more about the person. It will give them a platform to provide you with an answer that is meaningful. in many cases, this is a significant limiting factor. And I know it's not assessment in a psychometric sense, but it really does make the difference when you combine good questions with good psychometrics. Tell me about your weaknesses. Great. So you want me to cut my own throat? Give me a break. You know I'm going to give you some watered down, half-baked answer that even I don't believe in. Tell me about your strengths. You know I'm trying to make a good story up. I'm not going to tell you about the worst case scenarios. I'm going to give you the best. And you won't know whether I'm making up or not. So good, intelligent questions can make a big difference. The IDI career report, which is the questions driven by the scores in the report, can certainly help in that regard. And clients actually find it very, very helpful. You can read the rest for yourself. Graphology and astronomy. It's funny, some people still use it. This is a slightly more nerdy one. This is more broadly looking at the factors that through empirical research have demonstrated are very, very important. And it's not always what we think. The reference on this, by the way, is at the bottom here. So if you think I'm making this up as I go along, please read it. It's 100 years of research. It's a very interesting read, particularly if you enjoy multiple regression. But it's not just nerdy, it's actually very, very interesting about the way that they measure ability and utility of different assessments for selection, and make your own mind about what you feel works best in your context. But the brain power, the mental ability, seems to be a particularly important element. Interestingly, MRG did research some time ago on the factors that differentiate those who are seen as high potentials, rated independently by their observers only, not themselves. And a lot of the cognitive dimensions were the real variances, the ones that the real strong indicators, that the real differentiators between those who were seen as high potential versus those who were not. So the fast learner, effective decision making, bigger picture thinker, and such like. So there is something to this based on MRG research, and this independent research, which is very substantial and thorough, also indicates that. It's also changing. It's becoming more important. Now, I don't know why, because we don't measure causality. Arguably, people are operating in worlds which are more complex. There's more of the VUCA, there's more paradox going on. There may be more technology enablement, which requires an element of complexity to it. I don't know. But it certainly indicates that trajectory is shifting, that the effectiveness of mental ability tests when it comes to selection, it increases the probability that you're going to place a good bet on a person. But using them in combination with other selection methods, which is the incremental validity, is also a very, very part of this. And again, the general mental ability as well as the structured interviews are a particularly important combination. So, I mean, and don't forget, MRG don't create and we don't sell cognitive tests. So I'm not trying to pitch anything to you here. This is an objective piece of research based on what empirically is demonstrated to work. Now, IDI and LEA fit within the domain, but this is a specific thing in itself. Here's an interesting one, and I will be very curious to see how the virtualization and the video-based world that we now live in has, you know, influenced this. This research was completed in 2018 before the late unpleasantness. It would be great to do some research to see how that has shifted. And I know that there are organizations doing that research. So for the moment, this is a very legacy point of view. Take from it what you will. This can be an interesting one. There are tests that measure the integrity of the person, which are more value-based, or there are the subclinical features, which is the range between the normal personality and the pathological characteristics, and the subclinical zone being that zone where you gray from one end to the other. You don't suddenly change from normal to pathological. There's a zone of migration, the subclinical. And there are ones which, interestingly, can be really the differentiators between really effective people. The most obvious example is the inclination towards the narcissistic characteristic. And narcissism gets bad press. Narcissism, generally speaking, up to a certain level, indicates positive mental health. It indicates a level of assurance and self-confidence and self-belief. It indicates that the person does not need constant validation and approval from other people. I think it's a point after which it becomes problematic. But there's some very interesting stuff going on there. I'm doing this really for the sake of the recording rather than going into it. So I will let you review this in your own time when you get a copy of the recording. For those of you who are really interested in coefficients and this type of work, for those of you who are not, I'm going to move it along. But it does kind of validate what we said before, is that there is a pecking order of assessment for selection methods that do appear to work broadly. I think context is important. I think the sophistication of the client is important. I think the nature of the role you're assessing for is inevitably important. These are factors we all have to take a view on. But this is just something to give you some food for thought. And here's my final point. Brain power, general mental ability. Whether you want to use critical reasoning, whether you want to use classic IQ reports. I actually have in front of my desk this morning an old Cattell IQ test. I must try it sometime. Is that enough? Here's the thing. There's an argument which says that, you know, it's great to have the brains to handle the complexity of the task, but you have to have the willpower to apply those brains. And as Drew and I do love, we do love our little formulas. C equals I times M cubed. Capability equals intelligence times the cube of motivation. The basic premise is this: most people are intellectually capable of doing most things. It's not actually the biggest issue. It is clearly important, so I'm not being in any way dismissive of that. But the fact that people have the intellect to handle complexity, is that enough without the motivational desire to do all of that? If you have a significant appetite for something, if it personally appeals to you, if you find it rewarding, if gravity pulls you in that direction, you are going to find it much easier to access certain types of behavior, to commit to certain courses of action or trajectories from a career development point of view. You're going to want to do it. And it's very hard, legitimately, to teach someone to do something they fundamentally don't want to do, or to ultimately invite them to be someone they are not. So understanding the motivational underpinnings of a person gets to a few things. It gets to factors which are very intrinsic to the individual, less perhaps an indicator of their circumstance, and certainly more trait than state. It arguably gives you something of the predictive element, and critically, and especially critically in a selection context, it's measuring characteristics which are not necessarily observable. And it's one of the reasons why IDI is such a powerful tool in understanding the truth of an individual beyond what they can observe. We all know we go into interviews and we give a good account of ourselves, and we give our best case examples, and we try to avoid anything that makes us look, you know, ineffective, or we minimize at the very least. Tell me about things where it didn't work out, at the times when you know, all the negatives that they invite of ourselves. We mitigate that substantially. There's nowhere to hide with IDI. The design is such that's very difficult to manipulate. They don't know what they're loading on. We're measuring 17 different constructs. The psychometric characteristics are very, very powerful. They are 17 scales independent of each other statistically. The combinations give you a further level of richness. And when you combine it with the IDI, it is a heck of a powerful combination. And Drew is the person who's going to be telling you a little bit more about that. So I'm going to pause. I'm going to stop the share. And Drew, are you okay for the handover?
I am. Thanks, David.
Great. Over to you.
All right. Hello, everyone. right. Good to see some familiar faces. David, thank you for the first 20 minutes there. Whenever you use the word hierarchical regression, you know I get a little too excited. So there are there's just two things that I wanted to add to what David has mentioned here, and I'm going to go back just because I think it's so important. You know, when we look at this slide here, I think what's really important to remember, you know, you've got assessment centers on the top there. You have to remember that an assessment center is a selection method. It's not a psychometric technique, right? Why the assessment center sits up top there is because very often assessment centers are using many of the things that sit underneath this, right? They're using interviews, they're using psychometric tests like David has mentioned, they are using job samples, situational judgment tests, so on and so forth, and combining it to come to a decision for a particular you know, set of candidates. So one of the reasons why, again, they're so successful in this space is that they are essentially combining a lot of the techniques that David has mentioned here. The other thing I think that's really interesting here is, and as David said, with general mental ability tests, yes, they are the most predictive psychometric tool that we have. Cognitive ability, measuring cognitive ability, or better yet, whatever cognitive ability tests measure is our most predictive test. The big or most predictive assessments that we have in terms of future job performance. They have one enormously huge issue. They show subgroup differences. And what I mean by that is subgroups, minority groups usually score on average a standard deviation below majority groups. And that's a big problem, especially within the selection space. You know, it's obviously illegal in the first place. So yes, they're predictive, but they're in terms of whatever it is that they're measuring. And there's a whole litany of research that you can dig into there if you want to. But you got to be very, very careful with them. And very often it's why they are one element of a broader selection process, which I'll be talking a little bit more about today. All right. So I'm going to just dig into a little bit of the nitty gritty about using the IDI and the LEA in selection. David's given a great preface here about how they sort of generally fit in, but I'm going to go a little bit deeper here. You're all IDI and LEA certified, so this will be a little bit of a review, but I think it's important review. So you know, what are we talking about when we're talking about the IDI and the LEA? What do they measure? First things first. What motivates you? Well, that's IDI, it's not LEA. So IDI, remember, is you know, where a person derives really a personal sense of energy from, you know, what's driving them forward, you know, where is their motivational set coming from. The LEA does not talk about motivation. The LEA is much more about behavior. Second, you know, what are you good or what are you bad at? Neither of these assessments are telling you that. It's, you know, high scores are not telling you that you're good at something, and low scores are not telling you that somebody's bad at something. Really important to remember that. There are assessments out there that can get to, you know, technical expertise or you know, some specific element of a job if you want to go there, if you want to use them. Cognitive ability in some way is talking about the skill that a person might have at this or that. But that's not the IDI and the LEA. Again, important to remember that's why these are built into a broader selection system. What you're actually doing. Because the IDI is talking about motivation, it's not telling you what you are actually doing. Unless you are my 3-year-old toddler whose correlation between motivation and behavior is 100%, right? But we all know that's not the case. With LEA, we are talking about behavior. So what it is a person is doing, or better yet, usually in the selection space, we are talking about the LEA self. And as David mentioned, it's also the LEA self in sort of their current context. So the LEA in the selection space is really telling you how a person feels like they are showing up as a you know, as an individual, as a professional, and as a leader. And it's important to remember a few things about the LEA in that space, which I'll talk about as we move through here. And one of the big reasons, again, what David mentioned is why the LEA can be somewhat looking into the past when you, as a person who's trying to help an organization make a decision for the future. It's why it's important to pair the LEA with something like the IDI, where there's a little bit more, we'll say, consistency in some ways. So secondly here, where do these things come from in terms of the IDI or the LEA, motivation and behavior? IDI, motivation, really originates in the formative years. Behavior, on the other hand, with the LEA doesn't form at the age of 6 and stay relatively stable over time. It changes all the time. And so therefore, a couple really important things to remember with the IDI and the LEA. IDI, because it starts to originate in our early years, yes, it can change over time, but it changes a lot more slowly over time. And therefore, it's a little bit more resistant to the environment. It's a little bit more resistant to the situation. It sort of is who you are, or in terms of this case, it is who the candidate is at their core to a degree. Which is really important, again, in terms of what we're talking about. The LEA, on the other hand, because we're talking about behavior changes all the time. It can be drastically influenced by the environment and the situation, and therefore it can change quite a bit. Again, going back to what David said in terms of the space that they're in now versus the space that the candidate might be moving into. And then when we think about, and this is essentially what I mean when I'm saying temporal stability, right? In terms of the consistency of scores for these assessments. The IDI, yes, it can change over time, but if you take it right now and you take it again in 4 weeks, it's probably going to be relatively the same. If you take the LEA now and your situation changes, like a new job, as an example, it can change quite a bit. So because again, behavior, it just fluctuates a lot more. So what I'm trying to convey to you here is the importance of combining the two of these. And for me, and I know that David would agree with this, when we see people using just the LEA in selection, for me, it's a little wobbly because you are making some inferences where, or trying to help an organization make a decision where you're again relying upon something that might not necessarily be true in the situation that the person is moving into. And it's why combining it with the LEA can be really powerful. Okay, so the importance of psychometric elements here, and David really talked about this. I'll go into a little bit more detail here, but what are the IDI and the LEA key to? Two things I think in particular are really important. First would be authenticity, and the second is sustainability. When I talk about authenticity, what I mean by this is, whenever I use the IDI and the LEA in selection, what I really feel like I'm telling the client is, this is who you are likely to get, right? This is the person who is likely to show up for you. And sort of regardless of situation, or even, when times get stressful, this is the person who will likely sort of arrive for you, and you will see these things come out. Especially with the IDI, because again, we're talking about sort of the core of the person. And then sustainability of development or even onboarding. So when you talk about, who you are likely to get, it can also paint a picture of, these are the things that you're going to want to be thinking about initially of, no person's going to be a perfect fit, right? There's never going to be this sort of symbiotic relationship where everything is wonderful and perfect. Using the IDI and the LEA can help the onboarding process in terms of what we want to be looking out for. Where's this person going to need some support? Where are they going to be swimming upstream versus this is going to come more naturally? And then further and further down the road, where are potentially the areas of development versus not? And this is really, I think, again, really important toward what David was saying, is that, these general mental ability tests, cognitive ability tests, yes, they're great and predictive, and maybe they talk a little bit more about skill and ability, but they can't really answer the question of who you're going to get. They can't answer the question of how is this leader going to approach things? How are they going to approach the decision-making process? How are they going to involve people? How are they going to be when times get stressful? And that, as you all know, is becoming more and more and more important in terms of fit within, an organizational culture, within a role, and really what organizations are caring about these days in terms of who they're hiring. So LEA tells us what people do. IDI tells us why they do it, right? So the LEA is helpful in the behavioral space, especially when you've got a really good idea of the organization or the role that the person is going to be moving into. Because if you have the LEA and you also have that knowledge about the role and the organization, it can help you calibrate how that behavior might sort of show up in that specific role and in that context. But then the IDI really tells us, why they do it, and why a person, thinks the way that they think, makes the decisions the way they make decisions, why potentially they behave the way they behave, why they react the way that they react, why they have the expectations they have, why they approach relationships the way that they do. And so there's a lot of brilliance within the IDI. In terms of, again, their drivers, and then also their biases, right? Which is, we'll talk about this more and more today as we get into the case studies, but, paying attention to those high and those low scores. And to go back to what I just said, how does that create specific expectations for a person, in terms of how they think and how they approach things? And what is that likely to lead to in terms of how they show up as a leader? So in terms of why a person does what they do, let's just use an example here. So let's just say an individual scores high on empathy within the LEA, right? So they're showing, they are showing a lot of empathy in their leadership space, being very supportive, having relationships that would be, I will just call them deeper in some way, and connecting with people maybe on a more personal level than a professional one. So great, they're demonstrating empathy. That's a nice thing, but why are they doing it? Right? Why are they doing it? And there are multiple places, multiple drivers for potentially why it happens that way, right? Is it giving? Do they really enjoy the process of being helpful and supportive and nurturing? Is it gaining stature, right? Do they want to be seen in a particular way and be seen positively from, be seen positively from individuals, and they feel like showing up in a really helpful way? People enjoy that and respect them because of it, so they're motivated to do it. Is it excelling? Is it tied to their desire for achievement, and they realize that for them to be successful, they need other people with them, and for that to happen, they've got to be supportive? Is it maneuvering, right? Do they feel like it is important for them to be helpful for people, to be supportive and have sort of deeper connections with people? Because that helps them sort of capitalize on opportunity, right? So there's multiple places that empathetic behavior can come from, and I think it's important to recognize that, especially when you get into the selection space, because you can take the empathy interpretation and go a level deeper, right? And say, they're going to demonstrate empathy, and one of the reasons they might be doing it is because of X, Y, and Z, which is really, really helpful. So yeah, very simply, behaviors can be illusion, and IDI gets to the truth of the individual. We've got, one of the case studies here today, to use this example, it's the opposite in some ways, where there's actually lower empathy, but there are elements in the IDI that would sort of makes it confusing. So why does it happen the way that it does? And is a great example of, if you just use the LEA, it might distort your view in some way. And so using the IDI really can be helpful in sort of getting to the truth of the individual and really rounding out your own approach for sort of conveying whatever it is you want to convey to the client. So last things last year, I just want to walk through the candidate report really quickly, just the specific elements of it, and then share very briefly how David and I commonly will sort of report back to clients who come to us for a little bit of help in the selection space. So the IDI LEA candidate report, obviously the candidate's going to be taking both of these assessments, the IDI and then the LEA self. And it's broken into several different sections. There is an assets section which talks about, which really draws its information from the LEA and talks about what are the benefits of their high scores in the LEA, what are the benefits of the lower scores in the LEA. It then moves into the potential challenges, which talks about the potential challenges of some of their low scores in the LEA, also potentially some of the challenges in terms of overused behaviors. So scores that would be extremely high. You know, if you score 99 in strategic as an example, well, one of the potential challenges there is that you rely upon it too heavily. You get too deliberate in your decision making. You just look for that next piece of it. That next piece of information is going to be the one to tell me which decision to make, but you needed to make a decision 3 weeks ago. So there, you know, there are absolutely downsides to extremely high LEA scores. You then have the motivational considerations section, which in my humble opinion is the most important page in the report. And really it combines the IDI and the LEA data into one. There you can see right here in number 1, it's less emphasis on directing and leading others is further reinforced. If you ever do order the IDI and LEA candidate report, if you see that the term further reinforced, it means that there's alignment between the LEA behavior and the IDI motivation. So it's something that you really can sort of hang your hat on in a way, and is a really, really, I would say, important aspect of the IDI LEA candidate report. So I love that motivational consideration section because it's combining IDI and LEA data into one. And then as David mentioned, we've got the interview questions here. So based upon some of the LEA scores, the report will pull some of those behaviors and will give not only what the score is, so this person has scored lower on communication, what does that mean? And then what are some questions to think about in terms of probing that particular behavior? So the IDI and LEA candidate report can be very, very helpful in prepping for potentially that final interview with you know, the 2-3 sort of final candidates. This is not, I mean, it's not something that I would use to sort of, you know, we've got 15 candidates. Can we go through all of them? You can if you want to. It'd probably be a pretty lucrative engagement for you. But I would say more usually the report is much more helpful in that sort of final stage, final interview phase. And then last but not least here, when David and I commonly do this, we would take the IDI and the LEA and really write a report, right? And what are the specific aspects that we would hone in upon when we are doing some of this reporting? First things first, we have an executive summary, right? Based upon the assessment results, you know, what are we seeing? You know, what are we seeing in terms of themes? What are the things that we're seeing in both the IDI and the LEA that is very important in relation to what we know about the organization and the role? And then we break it into a few different sections that we find helpful in terms of interpersonal style, leadership style, and then strategy change and decision making. Again, this is really personal preference in a way in terms of the sections that we've talked about here. And you know, you as a consultant might have particular themes that you want to hone in on that you think are important for your own sort of assessment reporting. The client that you're working with might have specific themes that you want that they want you to talk about, and you can do that here. These are just the ones that we feel are sort of applicable regardless, and is very helpful sort of in whatever organization or client is looking for it.